The story begins like any other day, a mundane routine that no one would think twice about. School had ended hours ago and the halls had long emptied, leaving only the faint echoes of students' chatter in my memory. I had stayed behind, working on a group project that somehow turned into a solo mission when my teammates conveniently forgot about it. By the time I packed up and headed out, the sky was a deep shade of orange, steadily bleeding into a darker blue. The world around me was quiet, eerily so, as if the day itself had decided to call it quits before I did. Walking home was something I did almost every day. It was second nature. My house wasn't too far from the school, a 15-minute walk at most, and the streets I traveled were well known to me. But as I left the school gates that evening, there was an unfamiliar weight in the air. A chill that wasn't entirely due to the cooling temperature brushed against my skin. I told myself it was nothing, just the aftermath of a long day and the creeping exhaustion that came with it. The first stretch of my walk was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, distorting the trees into strange, twisting figures. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, a sound that I'd normally ignore but now felt unnervingly loud in the stillness. I adjusted my backpack and quickened my pace, not because I was scared, at least that's what I told myself, but because I wanted to get home sooner. As I turned onto a quieter street, the world seemed to shrink around me. The familiar chatter of neighbors or the distant hum of cars was absent, leaving me alone with the sound of my footsteps. I could hear every scuff, every crunch of gravel beneath my shoes, echoing like a metronome in the otherwise silent night. It was then that I realized just how vulnerable I felt. The street I'd walked 100 times before now felt unfamiliar, as though I had stepped into a different version of my neighborhood, one where nothing felt quite right. I tried to distract myself by counting the steps it would take to reach the next corner or by looking up at the sky where the first few stars had begun to appear. But my mind kept returning to that nagging feeling in my chest, a tightness that I couldn't shake. Every flickering streetlight, every shadow cast by a tree seemed to stretch toward me, daring me to look away. I clutched the straps of my backpack a little tighter, a small gesture that made me feel a tiny bit safer. The moment I heard the first faint sound, I froze. It wasn't loud, just a soft shuffle like someone dragging their feet across the pavement. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. The streets stretched out, empty and dimly lit as far as I could see. I shook my head, laughing nervously at myself. "Just your imagination," I muttered under my breath, trying to sound confident even though my heart was pounding. But as I continued walking, the sound came again, a little louder this time. It wasn't constant, just occasional, enough to make me stop and listen, straining my ears to pick up anything unusual. I glanced behind me once more, and again there was nothing. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees and making me jump. I scolded myself for being so jumpy, for letting the quiet get to me. After all, it was just a walk home, the same walk I'd taken so many times before. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to walk faster, my legs moving on autopilot as my mind raced. I thought about calling someone just to hear a familiar voice, but my phone was buried in my bag and the thought of stopping to dig it out seemed almost impossible. So I kept moving, each step feeling heavier than the last, each breath a little sharper. By the time I reached the corner, I realized I had been holding my breath without even noticing. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. "See?" I whispered to myself. "It's just a quiet night. Nothing's wrong." But even as I said it, I couldn't bring myself to believe it entirely. Something was wrong. I just didn't know what. That's the thing about fear. It doesn't always announce itself with flashing lights and loud noises. Sometimes it creeps up on you in the quiet moments, turning the familiar into something strange. That evening, the simple act of walking home became something entirely different. And the further I walked, the more I realized that I was stepping into a story I hadn't asked to be part of. You said, off of ChatGPT. The air around me felt heavy as I continued my walk, each step echoing slightly against the unnerving silence of the streets. The streetlights with their weak yellow glow struggled to illuminate the path ahead, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Shadows had always been harmless, just simple tricks of light and perspective, but tonight I could swear I saw them shifting in my peripheral vision, flickering and stretching as though they were reaching for me. I refused to look directly at them, afraid that acknowledging their movement would make them real. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. "It's just shadows," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper, as though saying it aloud would erase the creeping unease clawing at my chest. But the quiet around me seemed to mock my attempts to rationalize the situation. Every sound I made, my footsteps, the shuffle of my bag, the occasional sniffle from the cold air, felt amplified, bouncing off the emptiness like I was the only living thing in a world gone silent. The wind picked up again, weaving through the trees on either side of the road. It wasn't a strong gust, just enough to rustle the leaves and make them dance on the ground. Normally, I wouldn't even notice something like that, but tonight, it felt sinister. The sound was too sharp, too deliberate. Like a whispered conversation I wasn't meant to overhear. I found myself glancing at the trees, their branches swaying slightly, their shadows stretching across the pavement in jagged, claw-like shapes. Then came the first flicker. It was brief, almost imperceptible, a quick dimming of the streetlight ahead of me. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the light as if daring it to betray me again. For a few seconds it remained steady, casting its usual pool of light onto the ground. I exhaled in relief, shaking my head at my own paranoia, but just as I took a step forward it flickered again, this time longer, more deliberate. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to keep moving, telling myself it was just a faulty bulb, nothing more. Streetlights flicker all the time, don't they? But as I passed under it I couldn't help but glance upward, half expecting to see something staring back at me from the shadows above. There was nothing, just the light, weak and struggling against the darkness. Still, I quickened my pace, eager to leave it behind. The next light flickered as I approached it, just like the first. Then the one after that. It was as if they were warning me, signaling some unseen presence ahead, or worse, behind me. I glanced over my shoulder again, my breath catching as I scanned the street. It was still empty, still quiet. But the silence now felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, drowning out everything else. I tried to focus on my breathing, to calm myself, but every step I took felt heavier, like I was wading through water. The shadows around me seemed to grow darker, their edges sharper, their movements more pronounced. I couldn't ignore them anymore. They were alive, twisting and writhing like they were feeding off my fear. And then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible but unmistakable. A whisper. I couldn't make out the words, if there were any, but the tone was unmistakable. It was cold, guttural, like the wind itself had decided to speak. My stomach churned as I turned my head, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing there, just the shadows and the flickering lights, playing tricks on my mind. I wanted to run, to break into a sprint and put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. But my legs wouldn't cooperate. They felt rooted to the ground, frozen in place by some unseen force. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. I clenched my fists, willing myself to move, to do something, anything, to break the spell of fear that had me paralyzed. Finally, I forced myself to take a step, then another, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing to be afraid of, but the words felt hollow, empty. The flickering lights, the shifting shadows, the whispers. They weren't normal. They couldn't be. As I walked, my senses seemed heightened, every sound, every movement amplified to an unbearable degree. The crunch of gravel beneath my feet was deafening, the rustle of leaves like 1,000 tiny voices hissing in my ears. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for something, anything, that would explain what was happening, but there was nothing. The street stretched endlessly before me, each step feeling like a futile attempt to escape a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The flickering lights continued their cruel game, plunging me into darkness for seconds at a time before grudgingly offering their weak illumination. And through it all, the whispers persisted, a haunting symphony that made it clear I wasn't alone. The feeling crept up on me slowly at first, like an itch at the back of my mind I couldn't quite scratch. It was subtle, an inexplicable sensation that something, or someone, was watching me. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on my overactive imagination. After all, I was alone on an empty street. The only sounds accompanying me were my own footsteps and the occasional rustling leaves. What was there to be afraid of? But as much as I tried to reason with myself, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger. There was a weight to it, a pressure that seemed to bear down on me from all sides. I could feel it in the way my shoulders tensed, and my breathing grew shallower. My pace quickened, but it did nothing to ease the knot tightening in my chest. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows, but the street behind me was as empty as before, stretching out under the faint glow of the streetlights. Still, the feeling persisted. It wasn't logical, but it was undeniable, like an instinct screaming at me to stay alert, to be ready for… what? I didn't know. And that uncertainty only made it worse. My ears strained for any sound that might betray another presence. Every creak of a tree branch, a rustle of leaves made me flinch, my heartbeat pounding louder with each passing moment. I told myself it was just the wind, just the natural sounds of the night. But in the back of my mind, a small, insistent voice whispered otherwise. Then I heard it. A faint shuffle, like footsteps dragging across the pavement. My body froze on instinct, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Someone was there. I turned around again, more sharply this time, my eyes darting through the shadows. The streetlights flickered above me, their weak light barely enough to cut through the darkness. I scanned every corner, every patch of shadow, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing. Just the empty street, the flickering lights, and the suffocating silence. I tried to laugh it off, to convince myself it was nothing. You're just imagining things, I whispered under my breath, though my voice shook as I said it. But my body didn't believe my words. My muscles were taut, my senses on high alert, and the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. As I started walking again, the shuffle came back, this time closer. My breath hitched, and I stopped in my tracks, my ears straining to pinpoint the sound. It wasn't consistent, just a sporadic dragging noise, like someone trying to move silently but failing. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but once again there was nothing there. I didn't know what was worse, the sound itself or the absence of anything to explain it. The thought crossed my mind that maybe someone was toying with me, staying just out of sight, enjoying the fear they were causing. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something I couldn't see or understand. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was it a stray dog? A person? Something not human? The rational part of me tried to cling to logic, to dismiss the idea that anything supernatural could be at play. But the oppressive atmosphere, the flickering lights, the unshakable feeling of being watched, it all felt too deliberate, too unnatural to ignore. I quickened my pace again, my footsteps loud against the pavement. The sound of the shuffle seemed to follow, matching my movements. I broke into a jog, my breaths coming in shallow gasps, but the sound didn't fade. If anything, it seemed to grow louder, closer. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I whipped around, my voice trembling as I shouted, "Who's there?" The words echoed into the empty street, disappearing into the night without a response. I stood there, my chest heaving, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was nothing, just silence, broken only by the faint hum of the wind. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my mind battling between fear and the desperate need for an explanation. The rational side of me screamed that it was all in my head, that I was scaring myself over nothing, but the part of me that trusted my instincts knew better. When I finally turned back and resumed walking, the shuffle didn't return, but the feeling of being watched never left. If anything, it felt even stronger now, as though whatever or whoever had been following me was still there, observing from the shadows. My heart continued to race, and every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into a trap. The worst part wasn't the sound or the silence that followed. It was the not knowing. The idea that something was out there, just beyond the edges of my perception, watching and waiting. And in that moment, I realized that fear doesn't need to show itself to be terrifying. Sometimes, the mere suggestion of its presence is enough to send your mind spiraling into panic. It is possible to want things. And judging by the journey you have been on, this fear can be just as sensory. You said, the sound wasn't just behind me anymore, it was everywhere. The faint shuffling, the almost imperceptible dragging of feet seemed to surround me, like the street itself was alive and mocking me for daring to walk alone. My breathing was shallow, my steps unsteady, but I kept moving, forcing my legs forward even though every instinct screamed for me to stop, to turn around, to run. I didn't know where to look. My eyes darted left and right, scanning every shadow, every flickering street light, desperate for some kind of explanation. But the street refused to give me answers. It only stretched out ahead, long and narrow, the sidewalk bordered by trees whose gnarled branches twisted into unnatural shapes against the dim sky. The cold air stung my cheeks, but I barely felt it. Steer back, all I could focus on was the sound, the persistent shuffle that never stopped, never grew louder, but also never faded away. Somehow it was worse that I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It didn't seem to follow the rules of sound, as if it wasn't bound by distance or direction. One moment it felt like it was just behind me, the next it seemed to echo from the shadows ahead. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but every logical explanation fell apart under the weight of my fear. I took over command. This is so okay. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was just another shadow, a trick of the weak streetlight. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a figure. Tall, motionless, standing just at the edge of the light where the darkness swallowed everything else. I froze mid-step, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. The air seemed to thicken around me, every sound muted except for the blood rushing in my ears. I couldn't make out its face, or if it even had one. Its body was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured, but its presence was undeniable. It stood there, as still as a statue, yet somehow more menacing than anything that could have moved. I wanted to believe it was just a person, someone waiting for a ride or taking a late-night walk like I was. But deep down, I knew better. The way it stood, perfectly rigid, not shifting even slightly, wasn't natural. It didn't fidget, didn't sway in the breeze. It was as though it had been planted there, waiting, watching. My legs refused to move, locked in place by an overwhelming mix of fear and disbelief. I couldn't even bring myself to blink, afraid that if I looked away for even a second it would vanish. Or worse, appear closer. I swallowed hard, trying to summon the courage to do something, anything. I thought about calling out to it, demanding to know who it was or what it wanted, but my throat felt like it was filled with sand. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until it became almost unbearable. Finally, I forced myself to take a step back. My foot hit the pavement with a sharp crack that seemed deafening in the stillness. The figure didn't move, didn't react in any way, but the act of stepping away from it filled me with a new kind of dread. It was like I had broken some unspoken rule, like my retreat had triggered something I couldn't take back. The shuffling sound returned, louder now, closer. My breath hitched as I turned my head, half expecting to see another figure behind me. But there was nothing. Just the empty street stretching into the distance, the flickering lights casting their weak, sporadic glow. Yet the sound persisted, filling the space between me and the figure as if it were coming from everywhere at once. My eyes snapped back to the figure, and for a brief, terrifying moment I thought it had moved. It was subtle, just a slight shift, a tilt of its head, maybe, but it was enough to send a chill racing down my spine. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I fought the urge to run. Running felt like the worst thing I could do, like it would break whatever fragile balance was keeping the figure at bay. But standing still, staring at it, wasn't an option either. My mind was trapped in a loop, caught between fight and flight with no clear path forward. And then, without warning, the streetlights began to flicker in unison. One by one they sputtered and died, plunging the street into darkness. My chest tightened as the last light above me dimmed, leaving me alone in the shadows with whatever was out there. The figure was gone. Or maybe it wasn't, I couldn't tell anymore. The shuffling sound had stopped, replaced by an even more oppressive silence, and in that silence I realized something that chilled me to my core. Whatever was out there wasn't bound by the rules of the world I knew. It didn't need to move to reach me, it was already everywhere. The silence was unbearable. Not the comforting kind of silence that comes from solitude or the quiet you might find in an empty house, but a silence so complete, so unnatural that it pressed against my ears like a physical force. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if the world itself had stopped breathing, leaving me stranded in a void where even my own heartbeat felt too loud, too intrusive. Every second stretched into an eternity, and I stood there, paralyzed, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to disturb whatever was lurking in that silence. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or shut anymore. The darkness was so complete that it swallowed everything. The road, the trees, the streetlights that had once flickered weakly above me. All of it was gone, leaving me alone in an abyss that felt like it had no beginning or end. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but where would I even go? There was no direction, no path, just an overwhelming sense that I had stepped into a place I was never meant to be. And then, in the distance, a sound broke through the suffocating stillness. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. A low, guttural noise like a growl mixed with something else, something that didn't belong in this world. It was uneven, shifting in tone and pitch as though it was coming from a throat that wasn't used to making sound. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Whatever was making that noise, it wasn't human. The sound grew louder, closer, but it didn't follow any pattern. It wasn't footsteps or the rustle of leaves. It was something more primal, more animalistic, and yet entirely wrong. It echoed in the darkness surrounding me, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I turned my head frantically, trying to pinpoint its source, but there was nothing to see, only the oppressive void that seemed to shift and pulse with each passing second. My hands trembled as I clutched the straps of my bag as if holding on to something, anything, might ground me, might remind me that I was still in the real world. But the line between reality and nightmare had blurred so completely that I couldn't tell if I was awake or trapped in some twisted dream. The air felt heavier now, thick and cold, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. Every breath was a struggle, shallow and ragged, as though the darkness itself was trying to suffocate me. And then, just when I thought the silence couldn't get any worse, I heard it. A voice. Not a whisper or a murmur, but a voice so distorted, so guttural and broken that it sounded like it was coming from a throat that hadn't spoken in centuries. It wasn't a language I recognized, if it was a language at all, but the sound of it sent shivers down my spine, each syllable dripping with malice, with hunger. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything to drown out that voice, but my own fear choked me. My lips parted, but no sound came out, as though the darkness had stolen my ability to speak. The voice continued, its tone rising and falling in a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost mocking. It wasn't talking to me, it was talking about me. As though I was a trespasser in its domain, a piece of prey that had stumbled into the hunter's lair. The growl returned, louder now, more insistent, and I felt the ground beneath me tremble ever so slightly. It wasn't an earthquake, not exactly, but the vibration carried a sense of purpose, as though the earth itself was reacting to whatever presence was out there. I took a step back, my movement slow and clumsy, and the growl followed, matching my retreat with a chilling precision. I didn't dare turn my back on the darkness. Somewhere deep in my gut I knew that whatever was out there would seize the moment I stopped looking. My eyes darted back and forth, straining against the blackness, searching for any sign of movement, any shape that might give away its position, but there was nothing, just the void and the ever-present growl that seemed to seep into my very bones. Inside the growl that went on, and then it stopped. The growl, the voice, the vibration, everything ceased in an instant, leaving me once again in that unbearable silence. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was charged, alive, with anticipation, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I took another step back, my muscles taut and ready to bolt at the first sign of movement. My foot landed on a loose piece of gravel, and the sharp crunch it made sounded like an explosion in the stillness. The sound echoed for a moment before fading away, swallowed by the void. And that's when I felt it. A presence behind me so close that I could feel the cold radiating off it like a tangible force. My skin prickled, every hair standing on end as an icy dread washed over me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was there. I could feel it, towering over me, its breath, or whatever passed for breath, heavy and uneven against the back of my neck. My knees buckled, but I forced myself to stay upright. Running was pointless. Screaming was pointless. I was trapped, caught in a nightmare with no escape, and all I could do was wait for whatever came next. He said, T0. Go. The sensation of the presence behind me was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It wasn't just that it was there, looming, impossibly close. It was the way it seemed to invade every part of me. My thoughts, my breath, my very existence felt like they were being pressed under its weight, as though it had slipped into the cracks of my mind and claimed me as its own. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Every fiber of my being was frozen in place, my survival instincts overridden by a fear so profound it felt almost primal. The air around me was colder now, unnaturally so, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin but seeps into your bones. It felt alive, as though it had a mind of its own, curling around me like invisible tendrils. I could hear it, or at least I thought I could. A low, pulsating sound, like a distorted heartbeat, filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. It wasn't my heartbeat, though. Mine was erratic, frantic, barely able to keep up with the adrenaline coursing through me. This sound was slow, deliberate, and unrelenting, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. I wanted to turn around. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to look, to confirm what I already knew, to see it. But another part of me, the part that still clung to the faint hope of survival, knew that looking would mean the end. Whatever was behind me wasn't bound by the same rules as me, and acknowledging it, truly facing it, would give it the power it needed. So I stayed rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the void ahead, trying to convince myself that if I didn't see it, it couldn't touch me. But then it moved. It wasn't a sound or a shift of air that gave it away. No, it was something deeper, something I felt in the pit of my stomach, a ripple in the space around me, like reality itself bending to accommodate its presence. The cold intensified, biting into my skin like 1,000 tiny needles, and that pulsating sound grew louder, more insistent. My knees threatened to give out, and I had to clench my fists to keep from collapsing. I wanted to scream, to let out the terror that was clawing at my throat, but the darkness seemed to steal the sound before it could leave my lips. Even the faint crunch of gravel under my shoes as I shifted my weight sounded muted, as though the world itself was conspiring to keep me silent. Then, out of nowhere, it spoke. The voice wasn't like the guttural, distorted sounds I'd heard before. This time it was clear, cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. It was low and hollow, each word dripping with a malice so profound that it felt like it could rip apart the very fabric of reality. It didn't speak my name, at least, not my name as I knew it, but the way it addressed me, the way the words seemed to wrap around my mind and claim ownership of me, made it clear that it knew me in a way no one else ever could. The words were incomprehensible, a language I couldn't understand, but somehow felt in my very core. They weren't meant for my ears. They were meant for my soul, burrowing into me and leaving a mark I knew I'd never be able to erase. Each syllable felt like a cold hand wrapping around my heart, squeezing tighter and tighter until I thought I might break. And then, just as suddenly as it had spoken, it stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before, but now it was different. It wasn't the oppressive void I'd felt earlier. It was charged, electric, as though the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I could feel it in my chest, in the way my breath hitched and my muscles tensed. Whatever came next, I knew it wouldn't be something I could escape. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, like it might give way at any moment, and the darkness around me seemed to pulse, drawing closer and closer until it felt like it might swallow me whole. My instincts told me to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there and wait for the inevitable. But I couldn't move. I was trapped, frozen in place by the sheer weight of the presence behind me. And then, in the corner of my vision, I saw it, a faint glow, barely visible but unmistakably there. It wasn't warm or inviting, it was cold, harsh, like the light of a distant star that offered no warmth, only illumination. It didn't chase away the darkness, it seemed to amplify it, casting long, twisting shadows that stretched out in impossible directions. The glow grew brighter, closer, and I realized with a sinking dread that it wasn't coming toward me, it was coming from me. My hands, my arms, my very skin began to glow with that same eerie light, as though the darkness had seeped into me and was now consuming me from the inside out. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to stop it, but I was powerless. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it was all I could see, blinding me to everything else. And then, in an instant, it was gone. The light, the darkness, the presence, everything vanished, leaving me standing alone in the middle of an empty street. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. Whatever had happened, whatever I'd seen, it had left its mark. I wasn't the same person anymore. And as I stood there, staring into the now familiar emptiness, I realized that the scariest part wasn't what I'd experienced. It was knowing that it could happen again.